All right, so first thing I want to do is just go over the different disorders we've talked about so far. So the ones on the board and hoarding disorder. Just as a quick recap of kind of what each one is, maybe some of the symptoms that it involves. That's going to come up here in our assignment in just a little bit because you'll be using one of these to help complete that assignment. So first we'll just kind of start with the very first one we talked about, which was the generalized anxiety disorder. So let's see. How about we'll do Lanaya. Can you tell us a little bit about generalized anxiety disorder? Just kind of basic of like what it is. You can use your note thing too. There's kind of the basic description of what is generalized anxiety disorder. Or some symptoms of it, I guess.
A constant state of worry.
Yep. Yeah. So the big thing with it, right, is just kind of a overall heightened level of worry, right? Constant state of worry, or lack of ability to concentrate from that, right? So you've got some type of emotional symptom going on there. And remember, it does have some physical symptoms, right? There are some things that this does, like to your body. So we talked about autonomic arousal, trembling, sweating, fidgeting, agitation, sleep disruption. Those are all the like physical symptoms. Maybe the ones that are easier to see in someone to diagnose. And then maybe kind of after learning more about them or talking to them, we can figure out more of the emotional cognitive symptoms. All right, so generalized anxiety is kind of just having that heightened level of anxiousness compared to the norm, right? Everybody does experience worry, but this is like kind of having a constantly higher baseline than most people. So the next one we had was panic disorder. Okay, so this was maybe taking it a step further. So we'll go with Caden. How do we describe panic disorder?
Panic disorder is, it's like GID but more severe and frequently having like panic attacks.
Yeah, that's a big thing, right? So you do have that sort of heightened sense of anxiety, like the generalized anxiety disorder, but your big difference here is panic attacks. Experiencing that anxiety to such a high level that you go into a state of panic, where you have intense dread. Physical symptoms can be similar to that of a heart attack. Extreme fear, nervousness, feeling to escape, all that kind of stuff. And it's not just that that happens once in response to something, it's that it happens repeatedly and unexpectedly or maybe unprompted. Right, so that's what turns it into a disorder. Remember, you can't have a panic attack and not have panic disorder, but whenever you're having them a whole bunch, and especially if it's for seemingly no reason, and they're very intense, that's where you might start to see someone has panic disorder. All right, our next one was phobias. So we'll go with Elijah on that one. How would we describe phobia? is that different from, I guess, a regular fear? If someone's got a specific phobia disorder, how is that different than just fearing something? Or if anyone else wants to chime in, go for it.
When they see it, they just want to get away as fast as possible.
Okay, so maybe having maybe a stronger avoidance to it, right? And that's a big part of it. The main thing with this compared to a fear is a fear might be something that we get scared of just when we're exposed to it. A phobia is something that someone just kind of fears being around at all, just even the idea of it. And the reaction to it, even just the idea of it, can create sort of an uncontrollable or irrational desire to avoid or get out of that situation or get away from the object or creature or whatever it is that they might fear. So it's like a fear, but significantly more intense and more constant. So it has a lot of the same sort of like symptoms as someone that's just fearful of something, but it's much more heightened and constant, and it doesn't necessarily go away in the way that a fear could, right? If you put somebody that's scared of something around it for a while, maybe they calm down after a little bit, but someone with a phobia isn't gonna calm back down. What was our next one? Yeah. So then we had obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. What was OCD? It's one that gets maybe kind of confused or mixed around sometimes. There we go. So how would we describe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder?
Random and unwanted thoughts that can cause stress.
Yeah, right? So it's sort of having these like seemingly random obsessions or thoughts, worries, ideas, whatever they may be, and they kind of just pop up in your mind repeatedly. And there's a compulsion to address those thoughts in some way, right? Maybe an action needs to be taken, or it feels like it needs to be taken, and so there's what we call a compulsion, or the feeling of like a deep need to complete that action. And someone with OCD is going to feel really distressed in that they have to complete that action, and even more distressed if they're unable to complete it, right? And then it can lead to just full-on dysfunction, right? If this is really becoming a problem in someone's life where they're constantly having to stop and mess around with whatever their compulsion is, and it's interrupting work and relationships, this one can actually get out of hand, right? Maybe more so than somebody just wanting to clean more than a regular person. So we talked about one of the big things with it is the rechecking on whatever action it is. So we talked about how sometimes something like locking a door, most people would maybe lock it, kind of tug at the handle just to make sure it worked, and then walk away. Someone with OCD might lock it like 5 times before they feel comfortable enough to walk away, right? It's that kind of like rechecking, the need to do that, right? And so again, maybe that doesn't sound like much, but if it's like every single door you walk through, you have to do something with the handle, it's gonna start to like become troublesome, right? Every time you walk in and out of a classroom, building, car, just bedroom, bathroom, whatever area there's a door, if you have like a compulsion dealing with it, it's gonna take up your time to mess around with like every door that you see, right? So that's why this stuff can get maybe more troublesome than it might sound, right? Checking a lock a few times might not sound like much, but if you have to do that with like every single door, every single time you see it, no matter what, otherwise you get extremely nervous, it's gonna be kind of annoying. Hoarding disorder was another one we talked about. It is part of OCD, it's kind of like a branch of it. But what was different with hoarding disorder? What's its kind of specific thing? Yeah.
Well, when you get many things, you start getting attached to things, and so you feel the need to get more and more, and continue to attach to them, so until there's a lot, and you'll still continue.
Yep. So yeah, hoarding is basically sort of continually gaining possessions, and specifically not ever parting with them, right? There's this tendency to just kind of keep everything that comes in, say to your house, and there is a sort of like emotional attachment in a way to each object, even if it's something that's not super logical, like spoiled food. The idea of just getting rid of things goes against the compulsions that someone with a hoarding disorder has, right? That puts them in a very distressed mood, even if it's like tossing out spoiled milk, right? The idea of having to like throw away that jug with milk in it is kind of nerve-wracking for that person, right? So we talked about a bunch of effects of that, right? And we saw the video where it was part of the Hoarders episode, so we could kind of get a glimpse into at least one person's life and sort of their decision-making process when it comes to objects, and maybe how that's different from most of us, right? Most people probably wouldn't want a rotten pumpkin on their floor in their house, but the woman in that video was okay with it there and actually kind of had a hard time getting rid of it. And even when she allowed them to scoop the pumpkin up and get rid of it, she still went over and like picked seeds out of it to keep. So she still didn't get rid of the whole thing, right? She still grabbed like a handful of seeds from it to keep, because just totally getting rid of it was uncomfortable for her. Let's see. I think the last one we had was PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. What's kind of the big thing? I guess that's maybe a difference in PTSD compared to the other anxiety disorders, at least in its origin or where it comes from. Yeah. So yeah, PTSD is tied to at least one traumatic experience. We talked about how sometimes this could be maybe linked to several experiences or repeated exposure to the same trauma. And we did talk about some factors that could go into maybe making someone more susceptible to getting PTSD. Although really, if something bad enough happens to you, you could have somebody that hasn't ever exhibited an anxiety disorder, or really any like signs or symptoms of something with anxiety, but maybe they develop one through PTSD if they experience something bad enough. So this one is a little bit different, right? It's more specifically coming from an event, not something that we necessarily think of as maybe like a repressed part of our brain or a biological cause or a genetic cause. We know PTSD stems from a specific trauma or set of traumas. All right, So then we were looking at some of the different ways to explain of where anxiety comes from. We saw how guys like Freud think it's part of your kind of like repressed impulses. We saw how some psychologists think of it more as something we're conditioned to have. Some think it's more of a learned thing, right? Since we're social creatures, we pick up on typical things that people worry about, which makes us worry about them. So maybe if we hadn't have learned an anxiety about something, we wouldn't have it. Okay. Let's see here. So then we talked about how certain thoughts or cognitions can worsen anxiety. So this is kind of the idea that maybe someone's got anxiety, but their thoughts themselves worsen or kind of spur it along or make it more cyclical in a way, right? So this idea that maybe anxiety started to pop up in some way, and then people that are maybe more susceptible to it have these sort of thought processes that push it further and turn it into more of a disorder level thing. So I think this is the one we left off on. Was looking at the sort of biological and evolutionary perspective of this, where we talked about maybe how some fears or anxieties could have come about based on phobias over time, right? So things like snakes, heights, closed spaces, and darkness are pretty common phobias, right? But there are similar things that are non-phobic, right? Things like bright light, open spaces, low places, or fish. And we don't typically see a ton of phobias with those, right? And then we have things that are dangerous, but we don't have specific phobias of yet, or at least widespread. Things like guns, electrical wiring in cars. All of those things could kill you, but people don't necessarily have a phobia of them. And so to these evolutionary guys, they believe that things like heights or snakes or closed spaces or darkness has been something that our ancestors have specifically like feared and avoided. The ones who feared and avoided those things were less likely to die from them, and so they were more likely to have kids because they weren't dead, which would mean that the next generation might be more predisposed to having those same phobias and wanting to avoid those same things. And then they say that also explains why maybe we're not having phobias of guns, wiring, and cars, is maybe because they haven't been around long enough for us to evolve based on those things existing. Right, like people actually, average people owning and driving cars has only been a thing for like 100 years. So, right, maybe not having as much time with those existing to where the whole species starts to evolve a phobia of the danger that they pose. So then we start going to genes, right? So looking genetically, the makeup of somebody, the actual genetics that we have give us a like predetermination on anxiety. So again, one of the things that we'd seen in the past was the twin studies and how twins, they have the same genes, but when they're separated at birth and raised in totally different areas and settings, they have a weird thing where they tend to develop similar phobias, right? They also seem people in general seem to have a sort of inborn temperament, right? Maybe some people are just naturally more easygoing, and other ones are, maybe a little more hands-on, high-strung, whatever you want to call it. Right? Maybe more of like a stickler on stuff. And so they believe things like temperament could be encoded in our genes. And if we consider certain things going along with anxiety as an example of temperament, maybe that's also genes. Then you get to the smaller scale level here, looking at actual parts of our brain, looking at genes and neurotransmitters. Right, so the neurotransmitters, remember those are those like chemicals in your brain that get shot around. Especially some of the ones we focused on are the ones that control different functions in your body or emotions of your body and mind. So people with anxiety have problems with a gene associated with the levels of serotonin. That's one of the neurotransmitters that's involved in sleep and moods. So it seems like they have found in some different studies a way to say like, hey, if someone's got sort of a certain genetic makeup to them, it does seem like that affects their serotonin levels. And we know that serotonin does have an effect on mood and a person's anxiety. Right, so maybe we can track based on someone's genes if they're going to have regular serotonin production, or if maybe they might have some type of anxiety disorder, potentially, right? So, people with anxiety also have a gene that triggers higher levels of glutamate. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in the brain's alarm centers. Right, so this is one that could cause things like fear or worry or nervousness. So you can maybe kind of see how this could start to point towards anxiety, right? Somebody's got this genetic makeup going on, and it seems like they're having troubles with their mood, and they have a heightened sense of worry. And so maybe their genes are messing with their neurotransmitters to where they can't regulate sleep and mood as well. And they might be more excitable, right? More prone to getting like worried or nervous. Let's see. I think we're on to the final one here. So looking at still biology, the way it tries to address things like trauma, right? It does say traumatic experiences, they believe, can burn fear circuits into the amygdala. And these can basically be triggered and activated later. So something traumatizing basically can have a sort of like lasting imprint on the brain. And so later on, that sort of like burned in fear, right, can get kicked back on. Also believe anxiety disorders include overarousal of the brain areas involved in impulse control and habitual behaviors. So here's a pretty little brain. This is a brain with someone that's got OCD. Shows extra activity in the ACC, which monitors our actions and checks for errors. So maybe this is why someone with OCD has the compulsion for completing action and rechecking that action for errors, right? They have a really high amount of activity in that little yellow part of the brain. Maybe that's what's making someone with OCD go through and check locks like 5 times. Or maybe excessively wash hands repeatedly or something like that if that's their obsession, right? So the sort of biological view does help explain maybe a little bit more so some of the origins, but it is also kind of hard to trace, right? If someone's born with a certain set of genes and they do have anxiety, we don't necessarily know if they were born with a slightly altered gene, whether or not they would have it, just because we can't really go back in time and alter their genes to cross-check it, right? So there is still that element of maybe being difficult to completely prove all of these. But generally, most modern psychologists agree the sort of biological approach seems to have the best overall explanation for all the anxiety disorders. But again, keep in mind, this is also kind of the newest, right? So some of these other things like from Freud, right? Those are very old psychologists, didn't have as much information and technology as we do now. So who knows, maybe in the future, this will change again. All right, so that'll be where we pause on our notes. Next time we get back into notes, we'll be looking at mood disorders. They are a little different than anxiety disorders, even though anxiety does kind of have an effect on your mood. All the anxiety ones deal specifically with sort of the like anxious feelings. Mood disorders can be other things, right? Things that maybe cause mania or depression, right? Maybe not necessarily just anxiety. So, what we're going to do, the prompt for this is in Canvas as well, but I'll run through it with you guys here up on the screen, just to kind of explain out exactly what we're doing. And I kind of give a rough example at the end of what we're looking for. So we've gone through all the anxiety disorders that we're talking about here. We've looked at some of the symptoms they have, right, emotionally or physically. We discussed also how psychiatrists try to diagnose disorders based on things like their symptoms, their level of distress and dysfunction or deviance that a person is displaying. Right. So, step 1, we're going to pick one of these disorders to take a look at. And it's up to you on which one. You've got GAD, panic disorder, phobias, OCD, hoarding, and PTSD. So you pick one of those 6 things. And then step 2, we're going to look at a character from pretty much any type of media that you like. We're looking at fictional ones. I don't want to mess around with trying to like diagnose real people. But for this, pick a fictional character. It can be from a book, a show, a movie, kind of whatever you want. But you're trying to find a character who maybe, if we were a psychiatrist for them, we might wind up diagnosing them with that disorder that we're looking at, right? So we'll find this fictional character and try and see basically if we can diagnose them here. So we'll pick a disorder, and we'll try and pick a character that seems to match it. Just to give you some tips here, if you're looking at picking a character from like a movie or show or book, you want to make sure that they're a relatively major character, right? They got a decent chunk of like screen time, or maybe chapters about them. That way you have a lot of like evidence where you can show examples of their symptoms or ways that they're different, or establish a pattern, right? If you pick a character that only shows up in one episode of a show and they were nervous, but it was based on the events of that episode, that's not really enough to show a disorder. That could just be them being nervous because of the scenario they're in. So you want it to be somebody who's maybe around repeatedly within the story, right? And you can get a pattern of their behavior established. So step 3, what you're going to do is basically write out a paper, not a super long one, but I want to try and get about a minimum of a page. Basically describe the disorder you've chosen. Which one have you gone with? So, what are some of the like typical symptoms, distress levels, and stuff that it can involve? How does it deviate from the norm, right? Then you're looking at what symptoms your character displays. So you've described out like, hey, this is this disorder, here's what it usually looks like, here's my character, kind of an introduction to them, and then here's like several times where this character has displayed these symptoms, right? They've shown like anxious tendencies repeatedly, especially if it's in times where all the other characters aren't also anxious about what's going on, right? Showing that they're deviating from the norm. So then you're going to explain kind of like what leads you to diagnose them with that. What's your reasoning here, right? So you can say like, hey, I've seen this character, he was in 3 seasons of this show, and continually throughout it, frequently had panic attacks, sometimes just out of the blue. It was very distressing for them. It made it to where there were times in the show he wasn't able to do things he needed to, so maybe that shows a level of dysfunctional when it comes to this disorder. And so maybe this is leading me to diagnose him with panic disorder, right? Because it's showing that we've got an established pattern beyond the norm of panic attacks, and it is creating distress and dysfunction in that person's life. And then your 4th part, like your 4th paragraph of that, is kind of just summing it all up. Again, kind of what the diagnosis is, why you picked it for them. Again, recapping anything about the character or diagnosis that you haven't covered yet. So these will be typed out. You can just type them up in like Word or like a Google Doc and then send them into Canvas. But have them be a page long. Just use single space, like a 12-point font. So we're not gonna like inflate a paragraph to be an entire page long by making the font like 30. And grade-wise, we're just looking on kind of the quality of connecting your character's actions or symptoms accurately to the disorder that you're diagnosing them with, right? Do you do a good job in your paper of telling me like, hey, these were the symptoms of this disorder, this is what this character does, because of that, this is why I'm diagnosing them with this disorder, right? Just making sure we got a clear sort of line of reasoning there. And then just making sure you meet the length requirement for it. So as an example, I'm going to write out the full essay here. but I have kind of a character profile to maybe show you where you could go with this, right? Now from what I'm gonna show you, you'd have to write out the actual paper, but this just kind of gives you a way that maybe you could think of a character, pick them, and give them some type of like pretend diagnosis, right? So I picked Eduardo from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. I don't know if anybody's seen that or if that's just I'm old enough to remember that show. But the whole idea of the show is there were a bunch of imaginary friends that kids once had that they no longer have, and so they go to live in this foster home where all the imaginary friends are raised together or live together. So Eduardo is this big, like bull creature with big fangs, almost kind of like a minotaur looking thing. And his whole kind of gimmick as a character is he looks really big and scary, but he's actually very nervous and timid and super gentle, and not really at all what he appears to be. He's got a really big list of things that make him nervous, which is all on the side there. Right, some of them maybe sound kind of normal, like bad things happening to his friend, but then things like mops, butterflies, splashing water, broccoli, cards, are all things that like freak him out, make him nervous, or that he doesn't like. Index cards, 3-ring binders, band-aids, rubber bands, right? I think pepperoni is one of his things that freaks him out too. So he's got this big list of stuff that like freaks him out. So maybe for this guy, if you're not familiar with the show, he's in several different episodes of it. And he pretty much always displays a constant heightened state of worry compared to all of the other characters. He's always the worried one in the bunch. He's almost always the more fearful or nervous out of the group if there's a tough situation going on. He frequently trembles, sweats, fidgets, or panics in situations or around certain objects. Especially ones where, again, kind of the big thing here is all the other characters aren't bothered, right? Everyone else is just kind of acting normal and he's freaking out, right? So he's also shown in several episodes to at times withdraw from worrying settings or get nervous in social settings, right? So in this case, I kind of gave him the generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. He does have a long list of fears and worries, but most of them aren't to the extent of phobias. And he doesn't necessarily display the worry for having a panic attack itself, like someone with panic disorder would. But he does definitely demonstrate a distressing amount of constant worry and abnormally heightened worrying around different situations, and it does interfere with what he will or won't do on a daily basis. Right? So basically what I could do is somehow turn all this into an actual like essay format, but I just wanted to give an example of kind of like picked a character, looked at some of the things about them, right? And so then I could form a diagnosis from that, right? He's a relatively prominent character in the show, appears in most episodes, and is almost always consistently more worried or fearful than all the other ones. So that's what I want with him. Again, you guys can pick any of those disorders, any of the symptoms, and you can pick any character. Make sure to just give me a little bit of background info on the character themselves, like what they're from, and then how they are typically seen to act, especially if you can give like specific instances where like, hey, this guy had some type of event happen, and since then, he appears to be more anxious and maybe distressed and has bad memories and nightmares about that event, and so maybe that leads me to think he's got post-traumatic stress disorder. Right. So the rest of the time will be for you guys to get a start on this and work on it for the rest of class. We'll work on them tomorrow too. That way we've got a decent chunk of time to kind of go through, pick a character, pick a disorder, and see if they match up. It might also be handier. I know I did step 1 as the disorder. If you're having a hard time starting on a disorder and then picking a character, it might be easier to pick a character that you know is kind of generally anxious or nervous first, and then see what statistics you would assign them based on the sort of like symptoms and severity. So you can do it in that order too if you're getting kind of stumped on matching up a disorder to a character. Again, you can pick anything you want. You got like a favorite anime or manga, you got books you like, TV show you like. I guess if you have like a long story mode inside of even like a video game where there's a like NPC that has a well-developed personality and plotline that you interact with, you could almost kind of use that too. So, characters, pretty wide range. Whatever you want to pull one from.